right. In the interest of time, we'll get started. My name is Jordan Swain Fox, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, or CURA, at The Ohio State University. We're really glad to have you here today for our second webinar in the series, Is AI Sustainable? This series is co-sponsored by CURA, Sustainability Institute, and the Translational Data Analytics Institute. And throughout the series, we're hearing from experts on the ramifications of the expanding use of AI and growth of data centers. Today's panel will discuss the broad-scale energy and environmental impacts of AI. Before we kick things off, I just want to mention a few logistical items. If you require closed captioning today, you'll find a box at the bottom of the screen labeled CC. You can click this box and select Show Subtitles to allow you to view subtitles during the presentation. Throughout the webinar, feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We'll ask as many of your questions as we can throughout the presentation, and we'll hold some time at the end as well. But if we don't get to your question, apologies in advance. You'll notice that the chat has been disabled, so please use this Q&A function if you have any information to share with the event organizers as well. As you may have seen, this event is approved for 1 AICP CM credit, and to claim your CM credits, you can log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter the event into your online CM event log. There'll be a brief survey at the end of this webinar. If you have time, we encourage you to provide your feedback to help us improve these events. And if you have any questions after the webinar, you can email me at swaim-fox.1@osu.edu. Finally, to learn more about CURA's future events or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit cura.osu.edu. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on X and Instagram. You can learn more about Sustainability Institute and TDAI at si.osu.edu and tdai.osu.edu, respectively. With that, I'll pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller, to introduce our panelists today.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan. And as Jordan mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis here at The Ohio State University. And I'm really happy to welcome you to the second event in our Spring 2025 series on Is AI Sustainable? And we're looking at the impact of AI, data centers on energy infrastructure, on the environment, on climate, and on local communities. So today we have an interesting panel of 3 different people who come from 3 different perspectives. It almost sounds like it's set up for a joke, a reporter and a scientist and a lawyer walk into a data center. But I think we have some unique perspectives to explore here and very synergistic perspectives. And I'll introduce our 3 panelists today. Caroline O'Donovan covers Amazon for the Washington Post tech team in San Francisco. She previously covered tech and labor at BuzzFeed News, and where her coverage of Amazon's delivery service network won a SABU award. What is that again? I wrote this down, but
it's a business journalism award.
Okay, congratulations on that.
For the category was like logistics, so it's don't worry about it. It's not.
Still, you must be proud. Okay, over the past several years, O'Donovan has published numerous articles on the growth of data centers and ongoing battles regarding who will cover the increased energy costs. Dr. Arman Shehabi is a staff scientist in the Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division of the Energy Technologies area at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. He has over 15 years experience measuring and modeling the potential energy, economic, and air pollutant impacts associated with the large-scale adoption of clean energy policy and technologies for building and manufacturing, with extensive research on information and communication technologies. Dr. Shehabi's research applies life cycle assessments to explore system-wide energy emissions and material flows through buildings and industrial sectors. His current work focuses on emerging technologies and industries in the area of data center, energy and water use, electronic waste recycling, building material circularity, and industrial decarbonization. Last but not least, Megan Watchpress is a staff attorney with the Sierra Club, working to accelerate decarbonization of the power grid through strategic litigation and administrative advocacy, focusing on coal plants in the upper Midwest and market design and energy economic issues in Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. She is a co-author on white papers on the environmental impacts of cryptocurrency mining and best practices for large data center loads seeking to fulfill climate commitments. So you can see we have a very heterogeneous but very eclectic and I think very synergistic panel today. And what we're going to do is we have a bunch of questions we're going to go through that we've already talked about previously prior to this webinar. But we encourage you in the audience at any time to enter questions into the Q&A feature. And Jordan will be monitoring the Q&A feature. And when relevant, timely questions come up, we'll turn it over to him and he'll jump in and read your questions to the panel. And also towards the end, as questions start to accumulate, we'll turn it over for a while for Jordan to address some of the audience questions. But we'll get started with some of our prepared questions here. And this is for the entire panel. Just tell us how your work intersects with data centers and AI and how this has changed over time. Maybe we'll start with Caroline.
Yeah, so I cover Amazon for the Washington Post. And about a little more than a year ago, we started really focusing on data centers. Obviously, Amazon, through Amazon Web Services, or as they sometimes refer to themselves, Amazon Data Services, is one of the big hyperscalers. But we're focused on Meta, Google, Microsoft, now OpenAI, and all the rest of the companies. I work in California and San Francisco with a team of other reporters, and we really wanted to answer questions about how much energy, how much water, how much natural resources were these facilities sucking up. And as we explored that question, myself and my colleague Evan Holper, who covers energy for the Washington Post, learned more about how that might be impacting residential ratepayers around the country, or the extent to which some of the big tech companies, talk a certain talk about climate change and sustainability, but actually behind the scenes in practice sort of pursue other strategies to build these facilities as quickly as they possibly can. And then, sort of learned more about how the people who are going to be living next to some of these facilities are organizing to push back against them. So sort of a journey over the past year. My main job is to cover Amazon, but the data center stuff has been really interesting.
Thank you. Arman.
Yeah, so in your introduction, you mentioned that I look at both the industrial sector and buildings, looking at emerging technologies for like energy efficiency in those sectors. And what's interesting is data centers kind of are at the intersection of those two. When I first started looking at this, they were more in the commercial building category of you taking up a room or a floor in an office building, to really now they're more of an industry in themselves, and it's like large factories, practically, these large hyperscale data centers. I started working in this area, when I was working, looking at like the environmental impacts of like building design and operation. Back when I was a graduate student, there was I was associated with Lawrence Berkeley Labs back then, but one of the requests came from Congress back in the aughts. To estimate what data center electricity use was, and this was if people can remember back to the .com time, when in the late 90s there was sort of a boom of data centers that started coming up. That was the first wave of them, and there was a big growth from about 2000 to 2005, and there was a lot of concern about the growth of electricity use in data centers. At that time. And so that's when we really started looking at it. And when Lawrence Berkeley Labs started sort of refining our data center model to be able to like estimate what the electricity use is and how it's changing over time in the United States and globally.
Okay, Megan.
So I come at this from the supply side, the energy mix. My job is facilitating the decarbonization of the electricity grid through internalizing the costs of pollution through environmental regulation, and then challenging the prudence of spending those costs versus renewable, less expensive alternatives. So I come to this, I actually personally came to this by way of concerns with cryptocurrency and its strain on the grid. We began to see in 2022 coal plants that were deeply uneconomic and would otherwise have retired, for example, Hardin in Montana, staying online to feed cryptocurrency facilities. And at that time, the data centers were posited as a juxtaposition, right? Data centers commit to communities for a longer period of time. They're part of these. They're built by these hyperscalers. Well, the term hyperscalers wasn't a thing at that point yet, but built by these companies that have climate goals. They're perceived as more responsible actors in a similar space. And then beginning in 2023, with the Dominion Integrated Resource Plan in Virginia, we started to see proposals to delay coal retirements, such as the Clover Power Plant from 2025 to 2040, the Virginia City Hybrid Energy Center indefinitely, as a result of projected demand from these data center hyperscalers. And at the same time, we also started seeing some of the companies, Google, for example, increased its carbon emissions 13% year over year from 2022 to 2023. You had started seeing these public statements backing off on the climate commitments. So in September 2024, I, along with other individuals at Sierra Club, published a report demanding better that identified some of the best practices we thought for these data centers going in and wanting to have these large new energy demands. At the same time, we started seeing a massive gas build out. So gas plants in Wisconsin, continued operation of plant in North Omaha, and on a more macroscopic level, projections of massive increased demand due to AI data centers, which are being cited by the utilities, is pushing the cost of capacity up in PJM to record levels, which functions, given the complex energy economics of the market, as a coal subsidy mostly. So I came to this work from the standpoint of trying to shut down coal plants and increasingly seeing data centers being the reason, and the energy demand from those data centers being the reason that coal plant retirements that had been planned being postponed and new gas being built to accommodate this new demand.
Okay, very good. So in our last presentation in this series by Julie Bolthouse from the Piedmont Environmental Council in Virginia, she talked about the explosion of data centers and the projected demands in energy use in Virginia and some of the local and broader impacts. Can you help? I'll direct this at Arman, but either two panelists can jump in as well. On a national, international level, how has data center energy use increased in recent years, and what about water usage? What kind of trends are we seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is it's increasing, but not nearly as much as what's increasing in Virginia. But like a more detailed answer is we actually put out a report on U.S. Data center electricity use just back in December that put out new estimates, and what we saw was in other reports that we put out, we had seen sort of a flattening of the electricity growth in the teen years. But what we saw was that like around 2017, 2018, the emergence of accelerated servers started accumulating enough that it was actually having an impact on the total data center electricity use, and the acceleration of those accelerators into the data centers was quite amazing. Like, where is in, let's say, 2015, those accelerated servers, and when I say that, I mean, I'm talking about like the GPU included servers that NVIDIA supports, that, and these are the type of servers that are doing machine learning, parallel processing, or what to use for AI. These type of servers were really using like a negligible amount of electricity percentage-wise for data centers in 2015. By 2023, it was about half is what our model showed, which is just surprising how quickly that changed. And looking forward in the next few years, that's projected to grow. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but it's either a lot or even more. It's something in that range. I would say, like, from a numbers point of view, we have about data centers were about 2% of national U.S. electricity use in 2016, 2017, and more than 4%, about 4.4% in 2023. And that's not including crypto. We do kind of keep crypto in sort of separate category because it's the equipment doesn't have CPUs. It's a different type of equipment. It's operated by different type of players. And that's it, to put numbers on it. We estimate 175 terawatt hours of data center electricity use. And if we wanted to include crypto, there'd be another about 50 terawatt hours in there.
Is that big? Can you give people a sense of how big that is?
Well, that's why I was putting in percentages first. So that 175 terawatt hours is 4.4% of all the electricity use in the United States. So that's really more than almost any other industry uses in electricity.
We already have a question from the audience I'd like to actually give to this group. What types of data are available to map the location, size, growth, and so on of data centers and other water-intensive industry use centers? Do you have a sense what kind of data is out there so we can see where this is localized?
Yeah, I can say that the data is not very good on that. That's why we need like a lot of scientists to come up with complex models that can estimate the electricity use. The type of model that we use is called the bottom-up model. We have to estimate data center electricity use by tracking the equipment that we would expect to be in these data centers because there's very little transparency within the data center industry. They don't provide information around this. What's interesting for Department of Energy, for example, we have surveys and data that can tell you how much fluorescent lighting is in office buildings, but we can't tell you how much electricity use goes in data centers.
Wow.
I would
Caroline,
say
yes.
at the Washington Post, we were really interested in trying to create some sort of map that would show you where all the data centers were or how much water they were using, for example. And Bloomberg took a stab at that. And if you have a Bloomberg subscription, you can check that out. They did a pretty good job. But it is difficult. The companies, they tend to regard a lot of what they do as trade secret. And that could be how much energy they're using might tell you what kind of data center Microsoft or Amazon is using in a certain location. And there's questions of where they're locating them and, latency, right? So there's all different kinds of like strategic advantages that they're trying to get. And they feel like if they reveal the address or some of the specs around a build, that could reveal to their competitors what they're doing, because there is sort of this land grab and energy grab mentality in the industry going on. Also, I'm not sure if everyone in the audience is aware, like, some of these facilities will be specifically for Google's use or specifically for Microsoft's use, but there's also a whole major sector of the industry that's called co-location, where different companies might be using one, or even a company like Amazon, for example, might have certain facilities that are all for them and other ones that they're leasing through a co-location company. So the whole thing is, I wouldn't say it's shadowy, but it's not easy to put on a map, and the companies don't want it to be. There are a couple of free websites where you can sort of track this kind of thing, and people have talked about using satellite imagery because the way data centers look from above is fairly specific. But I think if you're already thinking about using satellite imagery to map this, that gives you a sense of how difficult that might be.
Megan, anything you want to add here?
No, that has been exactly our experience. We've actually had to use proprietary information that's gathered by like Googling to look at news reports of developments and things like that. It's been a real struggle. And I know cryptocurrency is a different industry with a different set of players, but it actually, again, mimics some of the problems with cryptocurrency. And there was an effort by EIA to try and get basic data about energy usage from cryptocurrency mines that was thwarted by a lawsuit out of the district in Texas. So we're seeing the same problem play out again with a lack of information for public representatives and interests and stakeholders in this process.
Also,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, something I thought was really interesting as I learned more about this is, there's I don't, maybe Arman, the exact number of electrical utilities in the country, but there's not that many. Like each state tends to have a different one, but they actually are all part of the same corporation. There's maybe, I don't know, a dozen or a couple dozen. But when it comes to water, there's like 4,000 different water utilities in the country, and they tend to be these really small kind of parochial institutions that don't talk to each other very well. So I think that's interesting to think about also if you're asking about mapping the water, some of those the companies that are dealing, if you're talking about Google coming to a town and striking a deal with a water utility, that water utility might only employ like 20 people, 50 people. They can be really small groups of people up against these big companies when it comes to figuring that stuff out. And when there is no federal organization that maps all of the water utilities in the United States, it's a very like federated group of organizations, which I just find really interesting. As a reporter, I'm like, oh, there's got to be interesting stories there.
So a quick follow-up is, so they're not sharing their data because of proprietary reasons, but what are these tech companies saying about these impacts? I mean, what are they telling the audience or the public about this?
Well,
all is good. Don't look behind the curtain,
Amazon loves to say that they're the largest purchaser of clean energy, the largest private purchaser of clean energy in the world for multiple years in a row, which, that's true. A lot of that is credits. It doesn't necessarily mean they're building more solar farms than anyone else, although, I mean, they honestly might be. But I think, the companies love to put out press releases that say, we're striking a deal with so-and-so, fuel cell company, or we're doing a funding round for a startup that's working on, a modular nuclear reactor that they can, manufacture little tiny nuclear reactors and put them on trucks and ship them all over the country and set them up next to our data centers. And that's pretty clean and it's pretty safe and it's pretty off the grid and blah, blah, blah. And that's true. I mean, they have a ton of capital, right? And they have theoretically some of the brightest minds in the country. So I think they are really innovators in clean energy and in some of these experimental technologies and pushing them forward. I think I went to a breakfast in San Francisco where someone was talking about capturing gas flare energy in Iceland or something for data centers. There's definitely a lot of smart people working on ideas for this, but the reality is, I think, as Megan said earlier, there just is no possibility of creating the amount of energy they need in a clean energy format. So a lot of the companies, I mean, I focus on Amazon because that's my beat, but also with the climate pledge, I think five or so years ago, yeah, 5 or 6 years ago, they made this climate pledge, to be totally carbon neutral, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's something that we saw play out last year, but we'll say play out this year a lot is, I mean, these companies are not going to make those goals realistically. So either they're going to have to come clean about that, or they're going to have to start presenting the information in a different way. But I think everyone is broadly aware that if they want to build the data centers as quickly as they plan to, they're not going to be able to get the energy they need to do that and also meet the climate goals they set for themselves. So that's what I said, I think earlier, like they talk a certain talk, but if you look, for example, when they're negotiating with an energy utility in a place like Ohio, they're not actually asking for the same things that you would. They're moving in the opposite direction of what their more broad public goals have been in recent years.
Okay, this next question I'm going to address to Megan, because in October 2024, you drew, in an article you published, you drew some parallels between data centers and the California gold rush. And you talked about how rapidly accelerating industries can burn themselves out and leave consequences for society and for the environment. So what are the consequences you perceive you see if this data center gold rush collapses as quickly as the 19th century gold rush? And I'll put a link to your article in the chat for the audience as you speak.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of double down on something Caroline just said, which is the speed here matters, and it matters in a couple ways. A clean energy grid is possible. Like, we have the technology for that. What the issue is how fast we can get it online relative to how fast these companies want power, and what the existing political and economic incentives are for utilities that are being tasked with meeting that power demand. So in terms of addressing the question that you asked about the bubble bursting, I think there are ratepayer economic impacts and then there are environmental impacts. On the ratepayer side, there's a stranded asset problem. Power is built to load growth projections, right? You can't wait and see if the load materializes and then hope to get a power plant online quickly. You build to projections and you build to the maximum, right? So 4% may not sound that big, but because our power grid is built to the maximum usage at any potential day, cold day, summer with lots of air conditioning, the marginal megawatt is really driving a lot of the policy and a lot of the resource mix within the grid. So if you build to meet the demand for a new 500 megawatt data center that's supposed to come online in 4 years, and then it doesn't come online, you've just built a 500 megawatt data center that you may not need for another 10 years, you may not need ever, given like advances in data response and energy efficiency. And that the cost of that data center is being paid for by customers, right? Especially if the data center customer, or the cost of the energy to power that data center is being paid by customers. And this is especially dramatic if the data center never pays an electricity bill, right? So the nightmare scenario is you build it to meet this data center that never gets built. The hyperscaler never pays a single electricity bill, and customers are then stuck with this entire cost. And you're starting to see utilities get a little bit panicked about this and proposing tariffs that provide insurance against this specific possibility. So you've seen a proposal out of AEP in Ohio. There were just settlement agreements signed in Indiana and Michigan, in Indiana, and APCO and Wheeling in West Virginia, where they're saying, we will build to meet your data center needs, but you have to promise to stick around for 12 years. You have to promise to pay a minimum demand every month. And the goal of these kinds of tariffs is to protect against the bubble and the notion that you may have built equipment to serve a customer that doesn't exist. On the other side, the environmental side, climate change is a time test, right? If you put the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, if you put the methane into the atmosphere, it's going to stay there. It's going to have the global warming effects. It can't come out again. And so every coal plant retirement that's deferred in anticipation of load growth, every new gas plant that's built, and new methane infrastructure, and a lot of the climate pollution associated with gas plants is actually on the fracking and the leaking and the transportation side. You're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that you can't take out, even if the plant never materializes, even if the data center never materializes, and even if that electricity is never needed. And so every delayed retirement announcement to meet a load growth projection for 2030 that may or may not actually come into being is locking in a set of emissions that we really, really can't afford.
Arman, have you and your colleagues looked at this issue of the impacts on climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. I mean, when we see the growth of AI and of data centers, I put it in context of, like I had mentioned at the top of the hour, I look at other industries too, and I see in one way I kind of take the silver lining on this is sort of an opportunity, and that there's this increased demand in electricity here as we're trying to decarbonize our entire economy. One of the goals in doing that is electrification. If we can electrify our transportation, electrify our heavy industries, electrify our buildings, that is a pathway towards decarbonization. Data centers right now, they almost completely use electricity, so that's good. That's good. Okay, so that's better than the iron and steel industry that's using like burning natural gas directly. So that's a starting point. I think what we have to do with this growth that we're seeing with data centers is put it in context of the broader sort of decarbonization goals. If we are going to electrify our entire economy, like our projections that we put out show a very large increase in what's going to be needed for the grid. So there's this opportunity that right now, this is kind of the first wave of an increased demand for our grid, and it's a test. If this is going from 2% to 4% to maybe 10% of electricity use, it's this growth of a few hundred terawatt hours in the context of a grid that generates 4,000 terawatt hours a year, that by 2050 might need to double. And so if we think about that, right now, as Megan said, like time is the issue. There's this rush to put things in. And if there's this scramble to just, patch things together and put things in the fastest way just to meet this first demand, that's not that's not a good way of trying to address this larger growth. Like, this is an opportunity to start building a foundation for a larger decarbonized grid of the future.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about that. I know, Caroline, you reported on, I think you mentioned about the energy provider AEP Ohio and they're setting up terms and conditions for data centers to be connected to the grid. Can you tell us a little bit more about this agreement and its implications for Ohio and beyond?
Yeah, so basically the utility was saying, just like Megan just described, that, you're telling us you need all this energy, this crazy amount of energy. And to accomplish that, we're going to have to build this infrastructure, these transmission lines and all this stuff. And it's going to be really expensive. And it takes us a long time. It's not something we can do very quickly, which is why we want to get out ahead of it, as soon as we can, because Ohio has a crazy number of data centers. It's one of the few states where like all 4 of the big tech hyperscalers are already there, already have projects going, and you have the, Intel fab as well and other new stuff. So they're saying this is going to be expensive and it's going to take a long time. And we are sort of afraid that when we finish it, this could be a speculative bubble, that this could be a speculative need and you're not going to be here anymore. You're not going to need as much as you said you're going to need. And we want to make sure that we're not passing the cost of building that on to other ratepayers in the state. So that they're not, covering part of the cost and then you're not here, or maybe there's an advancement in technology and you just don't need the same amount of electricity anymore, right? There's been a lot of debate about that recently because of news about, technological developments in other countries and whether or not this is actually something that we're sure that we need. And like Megan said, the way that utilities work is they need a lot of time because these are very involved, not only structurally difficult, but also legally difficult projects to work on. So they're saying that they need an 85%, I think it is. They want the companies to pay more money up front, the 85%, which is the companies want to pay 70% of the cost up front, and the utility is saying they want 85%, and they're going back and forth. And I reached out to them this morning just to see where things are with that. And they're not going to, it sounds like they're not going to have a decision probably until at least July as they go back and forth over what a fair deal would be for both sides. Which is, interesting, I think, because the companies are moving on a much faster timeline or would like to be. And so that kind of regulatory conversation that takes, months or a year, I think is frustrating to them, and is why you see things like in Minnesota, for example, the Amazon and the Data Center Coalition are trying to get legislation passed and trying to work out deals where they can exempt themselves from certain oversight of backup diesel generators. They want to install 250 backup diesel generators for a data center there. And they're saying, well, we don't really want to have to go through this process because it just doesn't really work for our timeline. So we would like to have the generators and not have to have any environmental oversight of that. So I guess we have to wait and see what the deal will shake out to be in Ohio. But I think it's true if you look around the country, Texas, California, Indiana, there are definitely representatives all around the country following these things and trying to figure out how they can get these massive companies to give them a fair shake.
Megan, yes,
yeah,
please.
I just wanted to jump in because Caroline mentioned the generator issue, which I haven't touched on yet. Because I've been focused on the energy standpoint and the carbon and the emissions associated with the grid. But the generator issue is a huge environmental one from a pollution standpoint, because all of these facilities have or rely on backup generators. And just as Caroline described in Minnesota, in Virginia, there was a law passed that expanded there was an attempt, I actually don't know the outcome, to expand the definition of emergency to allow the operation of these backup generators in a greater number of hours beyond what was previously allowed under their permit. So the localized air pollution from these diesel generators. Oh, Caroline, sorry.
Oh no, it was if there was grid stress, like if it was really hot or really cold, right? Which is not an emergency, and in fact,
yeah. So there's been the localized pollution from these diesel generators, which are way more, they're just dirtier. The co-pollutants associated with them are far, far worse than, large scale power plants, has become a huge problem. And there have been, as Caroline described, in Virginia, efforts by these data centers to get around existing regulations and laws governing the use of these generators, because their load, or their idealized load, is a 24/7 constant operation.
So there's a question from the audience I'd like to jump to because it seems relevant to our current discussion. So here in Ohio, we're giving these large tax abatements for these facilities with the goal that they help our overall tax base, like, for example, payroll taxes of employees and economy. But most of these taxes arrive when they're under construction, and there are liabilities, water use, power demand, need to install more capacity that will drive up prices, emissions, flood water coming off the roof. Is there anyone looking at the overall downside and opportunity costs of these abated taxes?
I mean, it's definitely coming up in conversation all across the country. I watched a city council meeting in Abilene, Texas from earlier this week, which is the supposed to be the, first big site of the Trump, SoftBank, OpenAI, Oracle, $500 billion, maybe $100 billion, data center deal. That's 5 to 10 sites around the country. And they announced Abilene first. And, there is a gentleman who went to the city council and asked the question that the question asker here is asking, which is like, have we really, done the back of the napkin math to say, well, is this worth what we're actually getting for it? And it also, in the AEP Ohio, that's the utility in Ohio. So they're saying we want the tech companies to pay more money, and it's before the Public Utility Commission to make a decision about that. And one of the arguments that they made, which I actually thought was pretty interesting, is they were asking, let's talk about the job creation per, whatever megawatt of the energy demand. So they're introducing this concept of, if we're going to be creating this much energy for you, how many jobs are you going to be creating? And then the companies kind of come back and say, well, no one's ever asked that before. That's not really relevant here. But I think it is clearly relevant to people who live in these communities and ask the question that you're asking, which is, why are we offering these giant tax abatements to these corporations that clearly want to be here because we have plentiful water and we're on transmission lines? I mean, I think there's also this sense that these facilities can go anywhere, which is not entirely true. There are very specific places that make the most sense for the companies. And I think a lot of people are asking, if we're supposed to put up with maybe generator testing, a couple times a month, that's putting pollutants in the air, or it's noisy, or all, over traffic on our roads, all these different things, if we're supposed to put up with that because this is good for the good of our greater community, let's make sure that that's actually true. And I think that we've gradually slid towards a little bit more transparency about how few jobs these facilities really create. I don't know if the companies would say that, come right out and say it, but I think in sort of like background conversations, I've heard them be a little bit more candid in recent years. Like, we can't really make the case that it's not a steel plant, right? There's not thousands of people with getting full careers out of this. It's not really what it's going to be, which is why you'll see, for example, a company like OpenAI talking about, oh, we're going to partner with local community colleges on startup accelerators, and or Amazon might say, oh, we're offering free AI job training so people can get jobs in AI and stuff like that. So when you see that, or when you see someone essentially writing like a round number check to the local public school district, maybe that's a sign that that they're sort of aware that they're getting the better half of the deal there.
Others want to jump in, Megan or Arman?
I mean, I think one thing I would add is when we look at like other industries and in trying to get them to decarbonize or sort of the relationship they might have with local communities, they're much slower to respond. They have slow turnover of their equipment, and they have small margins. Profit margins, and that's not the case with any of these companies. So it really comes down to what are the agreements that are being negotiated, and the agreements need to be advantageous to the communities.
Okay. I want to encourage the audience to submit questions to the Q&A feature, and we'll continue to go to those as time goes on. I have a question for the entire panel. Do we see any potential game changers on the horizon? Higher tech regulation, changes in demand for AI, technological or scientific breakthroughs that could impact our current projections and understandings of these issues?
I guess I can,
Go.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not the scientist on the panel, but I think the implications of DeepSeek, which is the Chinese hedge fund AI open source, potentially open source AI that's come live and been tested is interesting, and I think hasn't really been fully internalized in some of these projections. I've seen estimates that it's 30 times as efficient from a computing power and energy standpoint. And I think that there are deep concerns within the industry about relying on Chinese technology for a whole host of reasons. But the technical innovations that DeepSeek provides may actually, if adopted through domestic developers, significantly reduce the energy usage associated with AI technology. And I'm not a computer scientist, I can't speak definitively on that. But I do think that there has been I have read convincing analysis that suggests that the absolute amount of money that these tech companies have and can throw at the problem has allowed them to behave really inefficiently with respect to the underlying technology itself. And it may be that there are technological developments that reduce the need for these energy consumptions. I'm generally not a kind of technology will save us person, but I think constraining the energy usage and the money behind these may actually force innovation that reduces some of the social costs. From a regulatory standpoint, I think you're maybe in some cases seeing some self-regulation. There's a clean tech tariff that just got, a settlement was just filed in Nevada where hyperscalers themselves are thinking about ways to take advantage of the cost savings associated with clean energy and how to do that in a responsible way. And there's always the possibility that regulators will step in and try to protect ratepayers from some of these impacts. We haven't seen a ton of that yet. It's mostly been via settlement, but that is always a possibility and that we can hope for.
So
Arman, go ahead, Arman.
I'll jump in on the DeepSeek, and I think kind of maybe to like what you might be thinking about it. So DeepSeek, just to kind of give a little bit of background, is these like the U.S. data center like industry has been like making larger and larger language models, more computations to strengthen their AI models, and then DeepSeek came out using a tiny bit of hardware at a fraction of the cost, and essentially made something that was as good, potentially better than their models, and kind of made them look a little bit silly, and like the stock market like freaked out for a few days. I would say I wasn't that surprised by this because I think all of that will happen in the future. It's like that Chinese company was able to create this because they had to, because they were constrained financially and they were constrained with the amount of hardware they had. They were using like the fundamental hardware was still US hardware. It was still NVIDIA chips. They just were able to use them in a more innovative way. And what I expect to happen so first, I don't think that in itself is going to help the growth in electricity use, because even if you make the AI more energy efficient from a computational point of view, if you've got a 500 megawatt data center and you're able to like all of a sudden change the algorithm and you only need 50 megawatts, you're not going to let the other 450 megawatts sit there. You've already invested in that. And now you're just going to increase the amount of computations that you can do. There's just opportunity for that to grow. What I will say is that over time, I expect the industry this growth, they're in the sort of the gold rush stage right now, and they're throwing money at this. At some point, they're businesses, they need to turn a profit. And so, at some point they're going to have to figure out how to reduce their costs. And that's when innovation, will start coming into play to reduce the growth of electricity use by getting more out of every kilowatt hour. So I expect there to be a slowdown in the growth of electricity use.
To follow up though, I teach my students about Jevons paradox, the idea that efficiency improvements at the individual level create greater resource consumption at the aggregate level because it increases the demand for a product by making it cheaper. Is this a fear of some of these technological improvements and so-called green AI? I mean, won't we just have more AI if we make it more efficient? And how do we avoid this?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, the AI computations and are an example of like a perfect rebound effect, like more than anything else. Like if you take something like is there a rebound effect with LED lighting? That's something that we've looked at before. Well, you can only light your house for 24 hours a day. At some point, there's a limit. There's really no limit in terms of the amount of computations that are needed, at least at this point, because right now, like as I mentioned, the companies are in the philosophy of bigger is better. They're just putting more computations. So it is a perfect rebound effect. I expect over time that can slow things down by reducing the surge of equipment that's needed because you can get more out of the equipment. There will be a growth, but I think it does help slow down the growth.
But you mentioned you only could light your house 24 hours a day. And then I thought immediately of the Sphere in Las Vegas, like all new applications emerge that we wouldn't have thought of before to
Yep.
throw this technology at. So, Megan, you smiled a bit when I mentioned Jevons paradox.
Yeah,
Do you have something to add here?
I thought of it while Arman was speaking. Yeah, Devin, and I was like, oh, I hope I have that name right. No, I think that is a real factor. I do, however, think that there are serious questions about what the demand is and the profitability on the actual product that these entities are producing. And also around the training, right? The training, they're sort of running out of materials to train on. 5-10 years ago, there were like a proliferation of meal service boxes. You could like choose from a bunch of options, and those have all gone away. So I guess it would not be the first time that the surfeit of VC capital in the tech industry created a set of supply for which there was not as extensive demand as initially thought, and there is a equilibrium or calibration that is reached. I'm not enough of a technologist to make a real guess as to where that might be with AI, but from the standpoint of an environmental attorney, I'm deeply concerned that we're overshooting significantly in a way that's baking in carbon emissions before we figure out where that saturation point is for actual demand for AI services.
Caroline?
Yeah, the fellow I was talking about before, this guy, Sammy Garcia, he's an insurance agent in Abilene, Texas. And one of the things when we were talking about, he lives next to what I guess is the first Stargate data center. And one of the points he was making, which I thought was pretty astute in its way, was like, if this is for AI is this thing that we're always being told in commercials and on the news is like going to make us so efficient, and it's going to save so much, and it's going to make everything better and faster. So what like the industry itself is about making things more efficient. So when they're telling us we're going to need all this energy and all this space and all these buildings and all this water, we also know that it's going to automate itself to become more efficient. So he was getting at that question, I guess, of the speculation or the gold rush or the bubble, right? It's like, obviously, as soon as it's able to, it's going to make itself more efficient and need less of this stuff. And then, am I, as a resident of Abilene, Texas, going to be left holding the bag on that? And I guess that, kind of goes to Arman's point earlier, which is like, of course it's going to get more efficient, and whether or not we find really awesome commercial applications for it or not, or whatever, if it gets, bigger or smaller, either way, we're obviously, part of the way through creating all of this transmission and infrastructure and power generation and all this stuff to serve it. And that's actually maybe probably okay, because we're electrifying so much other stuff that we really do need to be working on that. But what we're increasingly seeing right now is the tech companies coming up with these plans for themselves to get the energy without doing that work on the grid and without kind of contributing to our societal need to update our grid and update our infrastructure. So you see Amazon in Pennsylvania saying they want to plug directly into this nuclear power plant there. Or you see the Stargate facility in Abilene. It's a solar and wind company, but they just got a permit to put a gas-fired plant there, and you're seeing, like I said before, about the small nuclear reactors. You're seeing companies talk. There's even a crazy plan for fission and for fusion in Wenatchee, Washington, if you want to read more about that, Helion. So you're seeing the tech companies sort of say, well, I don't really want to pay your 85% tariff, and I don't really want to pay to be a part of the grid if it's going to be crappy and take me forever. I think I'll just go and do this on my own, which is, I guess, sort of, the natural, business person's solution to the problem. But to Arman's point earlier, it's not getting the whole grid to the point where it needs to be, where the demand could actually help move things forward a little bit. And when I was reporting on this, Microsoft bought or leased or entered into some deal to get energy from 3 Mile Island, and Amazon has this nuclear facility in Pennsylvania that they have a contract for. And now there's this debate actually at the federal level about whether or not they're allowed to just plug directly into it and not pay certain fees and amounts of money that you normally would need to if you were on the grid, basically, is what's going on. And there's no decision there yet because of complicated regulatory issues. But I was interviewing a woman with the utility there about how these tech companies are increasingly trying to sort of go off the grid. And her take was like, there's no such thing as off grid, even whether you're talking about someone living van life or whether you're a tech company trying to run a data center, especially the data center. If you're in an emergency, if you go to the hospital, or if you're a data center and it goes down and you need to keep it online because whatever they say, there's like state secrets on it, or hospitals are running off the data center, you're going to need to go back on the grid. So the idea that you're off grid and you're plugging directly into whatever thing and operating on your own, like, that's kind of a fallacy in and of itself. Which I think, is when we're talking about where things are going in the future, that's a scarier possibility, right? Is that you have whatever independent nuclear reactors and gas-fired plants in all over the country that aren't actually all hooked together.
Okay, Jordan has appeared, and that means we have some good questions from the audience. So Jordan, please take it away.
Great, and thanks to all our panelists. So I'll combine 2 questions here that I think are sort of interesting. One participant asks, I'm in the architecture industry and we've been analyzing potential collaborations with data centers. The core issue is that our service is based on great human experiences, and these spaces tend to be quite sterile and detached from urban centers. My question is, do you see architectural design as a way to add value for data centers? Some opportunities are sustainable technologies, strategies to increase biodiversity, and others. For now, all architectural design has been basic and geared toward pure cost efficiency. And sort of related to that, we had another question about how in Ohio we have flat rooftops for these facilities that could accommodate renewables like solar panels. Is there a reason why that sort of business practice that could serve both the company and the public aren't occurring, or are there legal or tax implications to that?
I'll answer the second question. I mean, the reason why you won't see like PV panels like on the rooftop is because that would like contribute like such a small amount of the electricity that those data centers need. What you will see is you will have these large data centers, and then fairly close by they'll have like an entire wind farm or an entire solar farm. That's just connected to the grid, but they have that, like they will actually like build out that land, so that, which is actually would be a lot more than what's just on the roof. The architecture question is an interesting one, and yes, the buildings are usually kind of away from everything, and they're built to just be very utilitarian warehouses, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the idea of having sort of energy parks of industry that could be in areas that could be beautiful and have other activities and other parts, like things for the community, is something that could be there if there's a push for it.
I talked to someone yesterday in Minnesota who was very frustrated that the industry keeps using this word technology park, because he was arguing that that word used to mean like a big office park where people go to work every day, but now it's like when you're a city official, you sign an NDA, you talk about this technology park, and it sort of sounds like it has shiny renderings and it sounds like the thing that you're talking about, and then what they're actually building is like so obviously a server warehouse. He was like, I just think that the marketing of that is a little bit misleading. But my pitch for interesting architecture is, and I just Googled this to make sure I wasn't hallucinating it, but there are places that have used the excess heat from data centers to warm public swimming pools. So I would just do that.
I think that was done in the Olympics in France.
Very cool.
One really big swimming pool.
Nice. Another question we have, are there any communities that have successfully lobbied against data center construction? And if so, what were some key strategies?
I feel like I'm yapping everyone's ear off, but I did cover this last fall. I went to a place called Peculiar, Missouri, and they had gotten help from some folks in Indiana who started no anti-data center campaigns. They don't like to say that they're anti-data center. They like to say that they're pro-responsible data center. But these are, a lot of them were small towns. Or for example, there was like a golf course that's going out of business, and then the city officials sign NDAs, like I just said. That's a big part of this narrative in all of these towns going back, to when I worked at BuzzFeed, like 10 years I did stories about this. But these small town officials, it's, someone in a suit with like a secret code name comes in and says, sign this NDA and I'll give you $5 million in tax revenue. And they can't say no. And then they sign it. And then all of a sudden the golf course next to your house is turning into a data center. And if the zoning laws are changed, Arman said this at the very beginning, but this question of are these commercial or industrial facilities is a really big one in these towns. But if your town and your zoning commission gets that all lined up before they really announce it to the public, you're kind of, it's too late to stop it. So what I was tracking is different communities on Facebook communicating with one another, encouraging, if a new town has a data center coming, they'll say like, oh, we're going to send you boxes of these signs and we're going to help you get a public information campaign off the ground, because you have to go really quickly or it's all going to be signed and there's going to be really nothing you can do about it. And a lot of these small towns think, oh, well, we'll go to the state, we'll go to the EPA. And to be honest, it seems like in a lot of cases, if the city has already signed off on it, it's kind of a done deal. And then, get into the question of, oh, well, are there state regulations for how tall or how loud or how close or all that kind of thing? And in many cases, those are just being written and debated right now while the facilities are already under construction. But there's a town in Indiana that did, yes, successfully stop a data center from being built there. And the town I went to, Peculiar, Missouri, they also successfully, I flew into town to go to a meeting about it, and they learned that it was stopped the day I got there. So it was a very dramatic tale, which you can read on the WashingtonPost.com. But I think speed, communicating with your neighbors, getting a campaign going were all things, and like learning the zoning law and using the zoning law to your advantage. And I mean, not to be a dork, but like using the power of social media to talk to people who are in a similar situation to you, who are willing to share their knowledge. There's this guy in Peculiar, Missouri, Chad Buck, who seems to have sort of like abandoned his, not really, but his, his business, which is residential real estate development, because he's become a sort of nonprofit, volunteer, responsible data center consultant. He's always on the phone with people in Minnesota and other places trying to help them figure out what to do about data centers in their communities, and they're all different. Some are more offensive to their neighbors than others for reasons I won't get into. But yes, there are towns that have stopped it, but I think speed is of the essence.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you, panelists, for a very lively discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed it. And I want to welcome everyone to join us on Thursday, March 6th And that will be the next event in our Is AI Sustainable series here at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University, joined by the Sustainability Institute and the Translational Data Analytics Institute in bringing you the Spring 2025 series. That talk on March 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time will be by David Rolnick, who is from McGill University, and will speak about AI and climate change, opportunities, challenges, and recommendations. So again, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you panelists for joining us today. And I hope we all have a good rest of your day and a good weekend. Thank you very much.